Here I will showcase my updated timelines for all of Clamp's works. Just gonna plow through the first one's easy enough. Angelic Layer and Chobits are in the same dimension. They're approximately 2 to 4 years apart from each other based on Minoru and his dead sister Kaede. Her death occurred shortly before Chobits, and then moving on, the technology advanced, so about 2 to 4 years. Meanwhile, Shirahime, Kyunyan, Clover, and Gate 7 are all in their own dimensions. Moving on to the Clamp School timelines, we have 2 separate ones. The first is the Tokyo Babylon X and Combination timeline. Tokyo Babylon occurs, approximately 9 years later, X occurs. We see Subaru and Seishiro making their reappearance in X. Meanwhile, Combination potentially takes place alongside Tokyo Babylon. There is supposedly a Shoten, which was an early Doujin series that they made. Supposedly a Shoten series or a small short story where Seishiro is living next door to the main police characters of Combination. I cannot exactly confirm this given that it's probably a light novel section in Japanese only, but nonetheless, if that's true, then Combination occurs likely alongside Tokyo Babylon as they're also searching for the Sakurazuka Moi, aka Seishiro. Meanwhile, in the other Clamp School timeline, we have the events of Clamp School Detectives, 20 Mask and Deucalion occurring side by side. Potentially like Star's Army War, another early doujin, but was unfortunately cancelled. Occurs at the same time as characters like Suo and Nagisa are reincarnating into this time period as Clamp School students, and potentially would be occurring alongside the rest of these storylines. Similarly, Miyuki-chan and Wonderland might be in the same timeline because in Deucalion, they're watching X the movie, which is evidence enough why these are not in the same timeline. And Miyuki also watches X the movie in her own storyline. Hence, this is back when Clamp was not really doing a multiverse, so they could possibly be in the same dimension. Likewise, RG Veda is supposedly in the same timeline as reincarnated versions of Taichiro, or I guess technically Taishakten in RG Veda, and Ashura, his reincarnation being Shura, are professors at Clamp School. Cluster also might be in the same timeline. This was another early work by Clamp that was, Tamayo Akiyama decided to take the work and finish it herself. Clamp never finished it as a full group. But Cluster does show off aliens and a princess named Claire who looks quite similar to Eri Chisonji from Deucalion. So potentially it might be a reincarnation kind of thing as well there, or space aliens resemblance. So it might be in there, but it might not be. And approximately 4 to 6 years later, we have Clamp School Paranormal Investigators. This is evidence because at this point, Suro and Nokuru are in high school, and Nokuru is even implied to even be the acting chairman while he's in high school. Now, of course, moving on to what we're all here for. The Holic and Tsubasa timelines, along with their respective sister series, such as Kobato. This one occurs in 3 different timelines, the original, the altered, and the rebirth. And in each one, we have the time of Clow Reed. Now, Clow Reed was a sorcerer who lived from approximately the year 16-something, definitely beyond 1638, as that was the first contact between Britain and China. Hence, his parents, his father being English and his mother being Chinese, could not have met before then. And Clow Reed lived into approximately maybe 1984, as evidenced by the Mokona-Modoki series, and White Mokona and Tsubasa having recalled that Yuko, she's a fan of Mito Komon, but she knew both Mito Komon, the first actor, and the second actor when she was watching the series, to compare, saying that the first actor was better. The actors switched at 1983 to 1984, around that time, and so potentially that's when Clow died, as the Mokona series takes place in the last year of Clow's life, and the Mokona only with them for 1 year. But again, the time of Clow Reed occurs in each of the timelines. Now, in the original and the Rebirth timeline, we get Soel and Larg, The Adventures of Mokona-Modoki. This short little prequel to Holic, Cardcaptor, and Tsubasa showcases their adventures for 1 year after they were created, and as they're learning alongside Yuko and Clow, or learning from Yuko and Clow, how to use their abilities, they're learning about the world, etc. It's a fun little story. The full translation with accompanying music and occasional voice acting can also be found on my channel. Now, the reason this doesn't occur in the Altered, though, is because the Altered events do get changed around a bit, and later on the Mokona are seen housed in Yuko's shop in the Rebirth timeline, and so likely similar to Yuko, if they're in the shop they are protected from the time change that Tsubasa Lee does when he turns back time. And Clow's own events kind of conflict, as I'll discuss later, but likely the Mokona events thus only occurred in the original and the Rebirth. Now, we also do have Magic Knight Rebirth mentioned. The Mokona, of course, were cloned, or at least based off of the original Mokona seen in Magic Knight Rebirth, who was the god of that universe. Magic Knight Rebirth may also occur in the first Clamp School universe, the one with Clamp School detectives, 20 masks, etc. That's evidenced by certain characters, including Fu's sister Ku, wearing the Clamp School uniform, but we're not entirely certain of that. Nonetheless, this does occur in its own timeline, as Clow Reed and Yuko are mentioned in the second volume of Holic, I believe, to have traveled dimensions in order to meet the original Mokona, for which case they make the Mokona-Modoki from. Now, Cardcaptor Sakura occurs approximately 30 to 32 years after the death of Clow Reed, hence why it likely occurs about 2014 and 2017 then, as the series is ongoing in its Clear Card arc. Now, the reason for 30 to 32 years, as I've mentioned with the Mito Komon, is first off that, and then oddly enough, Kiro mentions in the Cardcaptor anime that he'd been asleep for about 30 years in the book. Initially, I had thought this erroneous, as I thought Clow Reed lived a long, long time ago, 100 years or so. And they always mentioned, the only time that they mentioned when Clow Reed died was a long time ago. But apparently a long time is constitutional for 30 years. So, yep, I'm glad I was able to update that for all you viewers. So Cardcaptor Sakura definitely occurs more in 2014-ish, as they do have smartphones as well. But again, definitely because of the Mito Komon point. Now, Kobato occurs approximately 3 to 4 years later, so hence, well, 3 to 4 years later from the Clear Card, the first year of Clear Card. So it would be approximately 2020-ish. I'm airing on the 3 years. We know this because Toshihiko and Emi and Toko are characters that appear in Kobato. Emi and Toko appear to be in high school. Toshihiko is about 5 years old, but a younger version of Toshihiko appears in Cardcaptor Clear Card, and seemingly younger versions of Emi and Toko appear as Sakura's classmates in Clear Card. And so if they're Sakura's classmates in 7th grade, and high school is 10th, that would be a 3-year gap before they're about the age that we see in Kobato. Unfortunately, though, that does mean that Toshihiko, when we see him jumping around on Toya's mascot costume, that means that he's 2 years old. Kind of a stretch. So maybe Emi and Toko were actually a bit older than maybe they were in 8th or 9th grade. Probably close to 8th, but I don't know. But that's as best as I can put it. Otherwise, Kobato would be in the Rebirth timeline. I can't rule out that possibility, even though I don't have it officially on this list. The only thing we can be certain of, though, is that Kobato does not occur in the Altered timeline, because the Altered timeline, as we'll see, contains Wish. And Kobato clearly has Kohaku mentioning about how she has waited for Shuichiro for about 5 times, meaning that he's died 5 times and she has to wait for his reincarnation every single time. Whereas Wish, we're seeing the very first reincarnation. But of course, as we see, Kobato is occurring in a time with Toya. Toya is definitely in Kobato, and other characters. Hence, it can't be before or during the first reincarnation of Shuichiro, and at the same time 5 times later. Hence, Kobato is definitely either in the original or the Rebirth timeline. Like I said, I think original just because Clamp took the time to actually make Emi, Toko, and Toshiko look younger in Clear Code, which I think is an indicator that Kobato is in the same timeline. But again, take your pick, Kobato could be in the Rebirth. Now, approximately 8 to 20 years after the 2014 events of Cardcaptor Sakura is when Tsubasa Lee is born. Tsubasa Lee is Sakura Kinomoto and Sharon Lee's son. And so I'm assuming that this is both year, and that, I mean, they don't look like they're that old, so I'd assume that they had him when they were about 18, but I guess it could be later on. I mean, Nadeshiko had Toya when she was only about 17, so you can really take your pick with how loose this portion of the timeline is, but somewhere between 8 to 20 years, I think a reasonable guess for when they decided to have a kid. And then later on, Tsubasa Lee alters the timeline in Clow Country 14 years in his time later. That said, though, I believe the original Clow Country is in the same dimension, given that Tsubasa Lee, he's turning back time, but he's not necessarily turning back space and time in terms of other dimensions. Clow Country may be in another dimension, I can't exactly rule that out, but given that all the crazy events that are going on, including the displacement of Kohaku, is occurring within the same dimension, I would assume that only the dimension that he's in is the one that's being altered. Hence, I think Clow Country is actually many, many years in the future, potentially even eons in the future. Now, moving into the altered timeline, since he did alter the timeline, we can move it there. The time of Sakura Kinomoto was about age 10, like I said, when she was Cardcaptor age, and Sharon Lee, I believe, is potentially 20 to 30 years pushed back. But the date of Clow Reed's death that could probably be pushed back as well. The events in the altered timeline likely played out a bit differently. We don't necessarily know whether or not the Cardcaptor events occurred the way that they did in the original timeline. They could potentially do that, but I would think somewhat otherwise, considering that Clow's not exactly dying in the same way that he did in Cardcaptor. Instead, he's traveling to Clow Country to be its king, so it causes a whole bunch of displacement issues. So I would still think it's 20 to 30 years pushback, alongside as well the evidence of the technology gap. When Watanuki is born, which would be about 10, 20 years again, just the whole, since Watanuki is the placeholder for Tsubasa Lee, he's literally the same existence. Be born maybe at the same time that they decide to have a kid. So maybe when they're 20 to 40, who knows? But nonetheless, when Watanuki is born, and when we see him living out his days in Holic, there's quite a technology gap in that there's no longer these smartphones everywhere like we see in Clear Code. It's more like technology that we saw back in the release of Holic around 2003, 2004, etc. And so I'm thinking Holic is around maybe 2003, and it takes place not actually 16.5 years after Watanuki's birth. He's about 16.5 years old at the time of Holic. But again, a technology gap would indicate that the displacement of time has caused a 20 to 30 year gap of pushback in when people lived, or at least those specific ones, because again, Kohaku had quite the displacement of potentially hundreds of years. Now, alongside Holic, of course, is also Tsubasa RESERVoir CHRoNiCLE. Now, in the same timeline, I believe is Tsukiya-like story. Tsukiya-like story is evidenced by the fact that in Legal Drug, we actually see Hinata graduating from high school. And so, Legal Drug, I believe it was Kazuhaya who asked for her school uniform in order to use that as part of a job later on. Meanwhile, in Tsukiya-like story, this takes place while they're in high school, but clearly not when they're graduating, so it's likely first or second year, hence Tsukiya-like story takes place 1 to 2 years before Legal Drug. Legal Drug, meanwhile, takes place approximately 0 to 6 months before Holic. This is indicated by the fact that, for one, Watanuki has to go talk to them in order to get some hangover medicine for Yuko, But more importantly, that Yuka has actually requested the services of the Everything Store, as she so calls it, otherwise known as Green Drug Store, in order to get the vase with flowers on it. I forget what type of flowers exactly, but nonetheless, well, I guess it's technically an urn, which is later used in order to send Watanuki to the mountain where Zashiki Watashi resides. Nonetheless, she makes the specific request of the Everything Store, and so likely this occurred 0 to 6 months beforehand of Holic. Meanwhile, when we get to the Rebirth, Holic has gone on for approximately 2 years. That's how long Watanuki is working for Yuko. And at that point, we get to the end of Tsubasa RESERVoir CHRoNiCLE as well, where we have the clones get reincarnated. They get reincarnated into the Rebirth timeline, and so this, again, is supposed to be relatively identical to the original timeline, but nonetheless, it is different. In the original, we have Cardcaptor events where Shaoran Lee comes over from Hong Kong and tries to compete for the Clow cards against Sakura Kinomoto. Meanwhile, in the Rebirth timeline, the clones retain all of their memories from their past lives and are hoping to one day meet each other, and they meet when Sakura is on a field trip to Hong Kong, and then their lives continue from there. So a clearly different event, but nonetheless, it still sets in motion the whole Tsubasa Rebirth, which occurs then 18 or 30 years later. Again, this is talking about when they were born in, not the 10 years going into Cardcaptor, hence 18 to 30 as compared to 8 to 20. But pretty much the events are supposed to play out like they did in the original timeline, aside from whatever happened in Cardcaptor, because clearly they live different lives. I can also give evidence for the fact that the Rebirth and the original are in the same dimension, because Tsubasa Lee does not get transported to Yuko's shop from a different dimension. He literally walks there. His father has told him to walk there, or to go to that shop, and it's in Tokyo nearby, so he's clearly in the same dimension no matter what you're talking about. So yes, the original and the Rebirth are both genuine points I believe that Clamp is willing to make. And so then approximately 14 years later, just like in the original timeline, Tsubasa Lee alters the timeline in the quote-unquote now original Clow country. It's all still following the same patterns in this far-off future, but nonetheless, it is still a different timeline. And again, it's unknown years in passing time, given that Clow country occurs eons later. So when we move back into the altered timeline, and this is now after the cycle has been broken, because now, going into this, the Rebirth and the Altered have continued on in a constant cycle, but the clones in the group have managed to defeat Fei Wong Reed, and so now they've broken the cycle, and the single Altered timeline can keep moving. With their explanation there as well is that if you're constantly just doing the same events over and over, you're not really living, you're basically in a cycle of death. And so by causing things to move forward, even if they're broken in many ways, it's still moving forward, it's still being alive. And so Drag and Drop then takes place approximately 1 to 12 months later, because at this moment of rebirth, Yuka has died, Watanuki has inherited the shop, and in Drag and Drop we see them speaking with Watanuki because he is now the owner of the shop. And Kazuhaya makes the comment that Watanuki looks about his age, so that means Kazuhaya is about 18, 19-ish at this point. And so not too much time could have changed then from the legal drug time period from earlier. I have heard that there is a inconsistency though of legal drug and drop, and that was meant to be kind of a, even if it's 3 years, it doesn't seem like it should have been that long given how old Kazuhaya is in the original legal drug. That might be an oversight, but nonetheless, 1 to 12 months after Watanuki takes over the shop, I think is the best place to put this. Now, we shall go back for a moment, because Wish takes place sometime way earlier. We know that approximately 10 to 90 years have passed between when Kohaku decides to go, well, ends up going to sleep as punishment. It's actually kind of a blessing for her, honestly, by God, in the series. Where Shuichiro dies, basically she fell in love with the wrong man simply because Shuichiro was about to die. And so as punishment as well for leaving heaven, leaving her heavenly duties, she's no longer able to be called an angel. And so her punishment is to sleep for 100 years in cherub form, where she's completely vulnerable to any kind of attacks because she can't use magic or anything in that form. Nonetheless, though, she's kept asleep in a very safe location guarded by Kokyo and Hisui, her angelic and demonic friends. And 100 years later is when Shuichiro gets reincarnated, which is indicated here by the wish ending of 100 years. That said, though, Drag and Drop Volume 2 has Kazahaya going to the Kudo residence where Kohaku is sleeping, and he has to wake her up for a moment in order to gain certain memories, in order to bring back to his bosses, Kake and Saiga, who is actually Kokyo and Hisui, in the reverse order, in disguise, watching over Kohaku from a distance, and watching over Kazahaya and Rikuo for reasons that we have not seen yet because Drag and Drop has unfortunately been on hiatus. Nonetheless, this is some point during her sleep time when she has to go back to sleep again, so it's approximately 10 to 90 years after she's gone to sleep, and well before, or at least sometime well before, the wish ending, where she actually wakes up and meets Shuichiro again. Now, Holic Row, Volumes 16 and 17, occurs approximately 4 years after Watanuki takes ownership of the shop. This is evidence because Domeki has now entered college and is working for his professor in order to work on various things for his degree. Meanwhile, a little ways later, 4 to 6 years later, in Holic Row Volume 18, we see Kohane, and now she is maybe around 19 years old or somewhere around that. We know she's in college, and Domeki is now teaching the same type of class that he once took, and Kohane is taking his class. We also know that Kohane was maybe around 11 years old when she met Watanuki, back toward the end when he was about 18. And so, approximately upwards of 10 years later or so, 8 to 10 years later would be when she's in college. And so that's when Holic Row takes place. Now, Holic Row, most of Volume 19 until we get to the final ending chapter, this is several months or years after Row 18. I'm not exactly sure where to place this. At this point, we know that Domeki has his own house now, but we don't know much beyond that. So it could be several months, could be several years. We just know that sometime after Holic Row Volume 18, some significant period of time. Meanwhile, Holic Ray and Tsubasa War Chronicle No Ikanai takes place maybe about 1 to 12 months after Holic Row, the beginning of 19. This is more so now evidenced because Zashiki Watashi in Holic Row Volume 19 seems to be in perfect health. She even sends Watanuki some sort of gift, I believe it was. But in Ray, at the end of Volume 4, or during Volume 4, we see that Amawarishi is concerned because Zashiki Watashi is in very poor health. She's basically dying, and if she does, she becomes a curse, which certain people can utilize. And so I doubt that Zashiki Watashi has gotten better beforehand of Volume 19. I'm thinking this takes place after, but we don't know exactly how long after. But I'm guessing within a year, just because the characters will look about the same age. For example, Domeki. Now, while we don't know exactly then how far the span is between Holic Ray and Holic Row's final chapter, we do know that Holic Row takes place approximately 150 years plus from when Watanuki inherits the shop. Before I thought that this was 100 years, but that was an error on my part because Watanuki's referencing something that he read, like some sort of movie or show or manga or something, where after he had received a dream from Yuko, this dream had indicated that enough time had passed for him to be able to finally leave the shop and he won't be affected. Before he had to stay in the shop, otherwise, well, it was payment for keeping the universes in check, kind of like how Tsubasa Lee had to travel universes constantly until the time was up. And so for Watanuki, Yuko is now mentioned in a dream that he can finally leave the shop, and he said, in comparison to that 100-year story, that it has been far longer than that. Hence, I'm definitely thinking it's 150 plus years, which would also align with the fact that Domeki's great-grandson is now the one helping out Watanuki instead of Domeki himself. Shizuka Domeki, to be precise. And so, 150 years about fits. Meanwhile, the Blood Sea anime takes place approximately 70 plus years from the end of Rei. This is because Watanuki in the anime, which is the canon one, not the manga this time. The manga was not written by Clamp, it was written by... dang it, I forget his name. Sorry, but it was written by the other member who did the original Blood series, and another independent writer who decided to collaborate with him, and the same was also true for the Blood Sea Demonic Moonlight prequels. None of it was written by Clamp. Clamp had their own vision, as evidenced by Okawa, one of the Clamp members, writing the script for the anime, including the anime movie, where Watanuki clearly says, as opposed to in the manga, that when you've lived as long as we have, referencing himself and Saya has clearly lived for likely at least upwards of 100 years. Hence, Watanuki comparing himself to her, he's got to be somewhere, maybe at least at 100. But of course, he also shows that in the anime, he cannot leave the shop yet. So this would be before that 150 type year. Assuming that 150 is the approximate date, and assuming then that he's at least 100, the Blood Sea anime takes place somewhere between somewhere between Watanuki's ages of 100 to 149. I've actually done a bit of math on this, in that in Blood Sea, the last Stoic movie, we actually see a calendar where the year of that movie is displayed. In this year, it's December 1st, falls on a Monday. And so we're looking for a future then that's about approximately 72 years after Watanuki takes ownership of the shop, but before he's 149 years old. These years occur in approximately the years 2081, 2087, 2092, 2098, 2104, 2110, or 2121. We do not know exactly when the Blood Sea anime takes place, but it does take place likely in one of those years if Holic takes place in about 2003. I know, crazy math, right? But it checks out. They are very advanced in technology at that point. The Mokona is now everywhere, so it's quite far in the future. Meanwhile, the time of Clow Country in this altered timeline, once again, is very far into the future. We don't know how far, we just know potentially eons, as said by Fei Wong, or at least when he's referring to the Rebirth timeline. In which case, as well, we do know that post-apocalyptic Tokyo is in the past of the original Clow Country. This is shown in Tsubasa. Hence, it would definitely be more so the Rebirth, because actually it can't be in the original, except with the whole breaking of the laws of time. So you might be able to put it in the original as well, but nonetheless, for simplicity's sake, I put it in post-apocalyptic Tokyo. This is where Sakura leaves behind one of her feathers, which is then recovered in Clow Country, the original Clow Country at that, for Fei Wong's plan. And so, this is my updated timeline as of 2021 as to how all of the Clamp series fit together. Like I said, potentially Kobato might be in Rebirth. There's still some ongoing debates as to whether or not Cardcaptor occurs in the Altered, but I think there are some reasons why that could not exactly be, including based on how Sakura gives away her Star Staff to the clone version. It's a very muddy argument. Leave behind your thoughts in the description. I'd be more than happy to discuss this. But nonetheless, based on how Tsubasa Lee has altered the timeline, how it clearly seems to be altering people and stuff and not necessarily transcending dimensions too much. That said, though, I will pose the other side where some people may cite that Tsubasa Lee speculates that his altering the timeline caused Phi to be reborn as twins, Phi and Yui, which is why they led such a harsh life, because in their country of Celeste, twins were thought to be bad luck, and so unless one of them wanted to die, they would both be exiled, and things just got worse from there. But again, this is just speculation by Tsubasa Lee. We do not know for certain whether that's true. Personally, I don't think it is, because it only seems to be affecting people in this timeline. But again, it's all up for discussion. Let me know what you think. This is definitely one of the biggest compilations of so many different series that I've seen. And again, for more information, especially on the old lives of Clow, Yuko, Mokona, etc., please see Soel and Larg, The Adventures of Mokona-Modoki on my channel, and I also have a Clow and Yuko history video where I elaborate their entire lives and just how the storyline kind of goes in general with their influence. Thank you for watching.